Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Monday, May the 10th. This is week, what did I say, 34. That means after this week, we only have 2 more weeks. So we have 3 more weeks left. And in between there, I know we have at least one holiday, one early release. So we are whittling down. So what that should also tell you is do your work. Turn it in, because I'm going to start wrapping up grades. Alrighty, so here we go. We're going to be talking about the Texas ecoregions, and Isabella has just informed me that yes, y'all have covered this in elementary, and I thought so, but also last year in 6th grade. So that's great, because that means this will sound familiar. As a reminder, you will be taking the STAR Math, and I think that is tomorrow. No, let me see, 7th grade. My little thing is covering it up right there. 7th grade is on Wednesday. And I don't think I will be relocated for tomorrow. But before the end of this period, I'll let you know. All right, so this is our new take. It says, State of Texas wants you to analyze the effects of weathering, erosion, and deposition on the environments in ecoregions of Texas. So the great part is that we've already covered or reviewed weathering, erosion, and deposition. You had it in 6th grade. You probably had it in 5th grade as well. But we're going to see how it affects specific ecoregions or different parts, different regions of Texas. So you can pull up a map and, 100 maps, and they're all going to be a little different, just depending on the source that you're looking at. But if we look for Bexar County, we're right here, and you can see, man, we're a little bit of everything. We're a little bit of this light pink, or light purple, which is the light purple. I don't see it here. That's interesting. I want to say that's grasslands. The dark purple is, no, that's the prairies. So this might be, I would think Edwards Plateau, but it looks gray here. I think this is supposed to be this gray color, honestly, because we are in part of the Edwards Plateau and sort of these areas here. And then we have a little bit of this dark brown, which is the South Texas brush country, which is a drier, arid area. And if you've ever been to Laredo, Cotulla, you know this is true. That it is definitely drier. That's the very tip of Bexar County, like on the south side of town, Poteet, that area. So we're right there, a little bit of everything, but I am almost positive this, what looks purple here, is actually Edwards Plateau, because this is the Edwards Plateau region. So we have a little bit of everything here in San Antonio and Bexar County. So what is an ecoregion? Well, these are the things that ecoregions contain that we're going to look at a little. They're geographic regions. They're places within Texas, and you can see this is like the West Texas area, East Texas, South, North. So they're different parts of Texas. It has to do with the soil that you find in those regions, the plant and animal life, and also the climatic condition. And it's amazing. The thing is, Texas is so big that we can have, one type of climate here and a different one down here. If you ever have a chance to travel, like on the East Coast, traveling through Texas would be like traveling through perhaps 3 or 4 different states in other parts of the country. Texas is so big, so we can have more than one climate happening within Texas because we're so big. So we're going to look at some of these different issues that define an ecoregion. So today we're going to be doing the Gulf Coast, or what is called the Gulf prairies and marshes. And you can see this is the Gulf of Mexico, the ocean, and this is the Gulf Coast. It's everything, part of Texas that lines the state. So almost the most southern part of Texas. And it involves everything from down here in what is called the Valley, and all the way across past Houston, Galveston, and ends right here at the border here. This would be Louisiana here in yellow. And then this is a different ecoregion, but you see it here in this dark green color. So it's the coast along the edge of the Gulf of Mexico. So what we see in the Gulf Coast is lots of erosion. And why? Because we get big, humongous hurricanes that come through there and wash up on shore. It could be the ocean rises, and as it pulls back, it takes a lot of the sand and the soil that's further up. And I've told you before, there's some beach communities that will buy sand to put on their beaches because tourists like to make sand castles and they want you to come back. So they will import sand from other places, especially if there's been a previous hurricane that has washed that away. What we see as far as a plant life is lots of wildflowers along that coast, not right along the beach, but certainly a little further inland. And along the beach, we do see lots of vines and short grasses. So if you've ever been to even Corpus, you'll see that there's lots of these little weeds and stuff growing along there. But remember, they may be weeds, but they're super helpful because they do help to hold on to the soil that may be eroded from just a rainfall. So they are absolutely necessary. What we see is there's less vegetation. You're going to have lots of these weeds and vines, but very few trees. And a lot of that is just, it's very hard for trees to survive in an area where there's going to be maybe lots of salty ocean water coming past the beach area. That kills trees. These plants are accustomed to it, and they're adapted to being, covered with ocean water, salty water. But there's less vegetation, not real lush right along the coast. And this certainly is true for Texas. It may not be true for every coastal area, but it is true for Texas. So hardly any trees. And also it's very windy. This is a very windy area. During the day, you have wind that goes out into the ocean, and during the night it changes and the wind comes in from the ocean. So it's very hard for trees to survive in that kind of environment as well.
The Gulf Coast Prairies and Marshes ecoregion represents a fusion of marine and terrestrial habitats. Geographically, the region spans from the eastern border of Texas and Louisiana to the southern tip of the state, bordering Mexico. Home to the longest barrier islands in the United States, the Texas Gulf Coast is comprised of sandy beaches and dunes, grasslands, numerous wetlands, and estuaries that provide refuge for a host of aquatic and wildlife species. Historically, this area of Texas was covered by over 9 million acres of native grasslands and wetlands. The coastal prairie was occasionally interrupted by forested areas, bordering the many rivers winding to the Gulf of Mexico. But over time, the human population increased, and the landscape began to change.
People settled here. They stopped wildfires because it wasn't good for their livelihood. They cleared the prairie for agriculture. They grew crops so they could make a living. People settled in cities, built industries, and as a result, they cleared essentially 90% of the prairie.
All of this land fragmentation and conversion has changed river flows. It has affected the water quality of marshes and estuaries. Although conservation efforts over the past few years have helped species like the endangered whooping crane improve, the same cannot be said for the Atwater's prairie chicken, one of the original inhabitants of the Gulf Coast Prairie.
The coastal prairie is the home of the Atwater's prairie chicken. When the people first arrived here, there were hundreds of thousands of them. Today, we only have a few dozen left in the wild. The population primarily crashed due to habitat loss when the land was converted to cities and agriculture, or planted into these exotic grasses for livestock production. The chickens have more or less went away.
Oh, they're so
habitat,
cute.
and we're busily working with these private landowners in this part of Texas to try to restore the Atwater's prairie chicken.
Habitat fragmentation is the real enemy of the Atwater's prairie chicken. There is simply not enough connected prairie to sustain the species. With every new road and community established to support an ever-increasing Texas population, more fragmentation occurs. These days, the Atwater's prairie chicken is raised in zoos and released in the wild in hopes they will increase their numbers on their own.
We estimate you need in the neighborhood of 80,000 acres of connected grasslands for the chickens to survive. So even though you may have patches in different places of a few hundred to a few thousand acres, if they're not connected, these species dependent upon these grasslands will disappear, or they will not do as well as they should.
The Atwater's prairie chicken is not the only species struggling to survive along the Gulf Coast. Native species like the bobwhite quail and the mottled duck are also experiencing a dramatic decline in populations due to decreasing prairie and wetland habitats. Something else that has declined over time is the occurrence of wildfire. For the most part, wildfires are contained today to protect homes, cities, and industry. Keepers of the prairie now use prescribed or controlled burns to help sustain what is left of the native prairie habitat.
In areas that manage very heavily for wildlife, controlled burns is a regular management tool. We use it in woodlands, we use it in the coastal marshes, we use it in these prairies here, and it does basically the same job every time. It sets back succession, controls the sharp, woody plants, allows herbaceous plants to be more vigorous and more productive. Landowners use it at some scale throughout Texas, but by and large we have a high usage of it in the prairie because one, fire is essential for the prairie to maintain itself as a prairie, and two, we have organizations here which are funding prescribed burn on private property.
The Texas Gulf Coast is also an annual stopover point for thousands of neotropical migratory birds. Songbirds, hummingbirds, birds of prey, all depend heavily on the coastal marshes. Degraded habitat not only means fewer safe harbors for migratory birds, but a threatened cycle of life for many other species.
We have a lot of gulls, terns, egrets, and herons, which eat a lot of fish and shrimp in the marshes. And these marshes are really productive for wetland-dependent wildlife. Most of our waterfowl, most of our fur bearers, and many of our birds depend upon these marshes for their survival. What's happening in Texas, urbanization, industry, taking up huge acres of marshland, we're also creating navigation corridors for our shipping.
The degradation of this ecoregion also impacts outdoor recreation, which helps support the Gulf Coast economy. Whether birdwatching or beachcombing, declining habitats mean declining income for the area. Striving to achieve balance for all the needs placed on the Gulf Coast prairies and marshes will be an ongoing process as our population grows. Private landowners will continue to be key players in helping maintain this ecoregion.
You did.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
All right, sorry about that. Let's go on to our next slide. So you can see that poor little prairie chicken. And you know, one of the things that the point that it's making
Gulf Coast
is
prairie-
that fragmented. It means that before you used to have the whole state to run around if it wanted to, but now you have roads and houses and neighborhoods that block it from it going wherever it wants to. And Texas continues to be one of the states that more people are moving to more than ever. The Piney Woods. The Piney Woods are so pretty. So this is an area, and this is looking at this area right here, there's all kinds of beautiful pine trees. Just really, really pretty. Some really tall, some, shorter and fatter. But it's a really pretty area of Texas, which almost doesn't seem like this should be Texas. And that's probably not my favorite picture. But there's lots of vegetation, lots of trees, lots of plants growing. Pine trees, oak trees, cedar. Flowering trees would be like magnolias that grow in the area. And so, lots of people, like my husband grew up in the Houston area, and he always wants to have pine trees to plant some in our yard. And the reality is that they will not grow. We have a different type of soil in San Antonio than they do in that Houston area. Their soil is acidic, and that's what these pine trees need to survive. Lots of humidity because it's near the Gulf Coast as well. But the good thing there in that part of Texas is that these trees help create an anchor for the soil and for it not to be washed away. So there's a lot less erosion, even though hurricanes go on so here's the Piney Woods hit in this area. They have less erosion because remember, in the coast, they hardly had any vegetation. They just have kind of some vines and grasses. Here we have big full-fledged forests that help hold on to the soil, so we have less erosion that happens.
The Piney Woods ecoregion is a mosaic of woodlands, forests, and prairies dissected by rivers, lakes, and marshes. Covering much of the eastern border of Texas, this ecoregion stretches from the Red River in the north to the edge of the Gulf Coast prairies at its southernmost point. Numerous species of neotropical birds, waterfowl, fur bearers, and reptiles inhabit this heavily forested and historically diverse ecosystem. But by the early 1900s, the demand on this timber-rich resource began to change the landscape.
There are two major threats facing the Piney Woods ecosystem in Texas. The first being some of the historical practices of the logging industry, and the second being the loss of bottomland hardwoods to reservoir construction. The logging industry has replaced a lot of the diverse pine forests and replaced them with basically loblolly pine. And so what we're seeing is reduced biodiversity in our pine forests.
The forest is harvested at a much younger age than it would have grown to in a natural setting. The shortleaf pine forest in northeast Texas, for instance, would live anywhere from 150 to 200 plus years of age biologically. The rotation age on pine timber today is somewhere between 25 and 35 years.
So those trees used to live up to 100 years, but now we chop them down a lot sooner.
Sustainability. Many corporations within the timber industry now participate in the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, which certifies their products based on responsible management practices. One such practice is establishing streamside management zones where logging activity is greatly minimized to protect water quality and help prevent non-point source pollution. But there are wildlife species still recovering from the loss of old-growth forests in East Texas. One of these species is the federally endangered red-cockaded woodpecker.
In mature pine savanna forested habitat, one keystone species for that habitat is the red-cockaded woodpecker. A keystone species is an indicator species for an entire ecosystem. So when you have problems with that species, you have problems with an entire suite of species.
Fire helps maintain forested systems like the piney woods, clearing out the understory vegetation while leaving the older, more established pine trees.
In many habitats, understory is an essential component to the ecosystem. But in East Texas, many species are adapted to flying in between the trees, much like a quail runs in between the grasses in a prairie ecosystem. The red-cockaded woodpecker, however, requires really big, really old pine trees in which to nest, and they nest in them year after year. And they require a clear understory in order to move among the trees.
But today, natural fires are usually suppressed for the safety of people, their homes, and businesses, which consequently impacts the historical role fire played in these forests. This is why prescribed burning is such an important part of habitat restoration within the piney woods.
Probably one of the greatest ecological restoration tools, other than allowing these forests to grow to a later age, would be to apply prescribed burning adequately to these forests. So when you perform management for that species, the red-cockaded woodpecker, by promoting mature pine forests and managing them for an open park-like condition with a grassy herbaceous understory, then you're also managing for other species like brown-headed nuthatch, Bachman's sparrow, and a number of other species like Louisiana pine snake, which is a state-listed threatened snake that's one of the rarest snakes on the North American continent.
Throughout the piney woods ecoregion, water is a key component in maintaining the health of bottomland hardwoods. Periodic flooding replenishes the soil, supporting a diverse plant and animal community. But human needs for this same water is having a profound impact.
We probably lost anywhere from 70 to 80% of the original bottomland hardwood forest that occurred in East Texas because of reservoir construction. And these reservoirs, although they're very important for human needs for water, they have altered the hydrology of the landscape so that water does not move along that landscape the same way it did historically.
Changes in hydrology here impacted one of the oldest known aquatic species, the paddlefish.
The paddlefish used to move up native river systems to spawn, and it migrated to spawn, and it needed clear water over shallow gravel beds to spawn. But with the changed hydrology, number one, it can't migrate up those river systems anymore. Number two, because the water levels have been changed and they stay higher for longer periods of time during the spawning, those fish cannot spawn anymore.
In addition to timber harvesting and reservoir construction, population growth is also beginning to impact East Texas.
An emerging threat that we're starting to see in the piney woods is urbanization. Our human population in this state is exploding. Urbanization is creeping into the piney woods just like it is many other habitats of this state. The problems with urbanization are many. One is fragmentation, just simply a loss of that continuity of habitat.
So you end up with a checkerboard or patchwork type mosaic, and the arrangement of those patches becomes critical to wildlife. Some species need broad, expansive forests, and those species are in peril, particularly things like neotropical migratory birds in bottomland hardwood type forest habitats. Also, many areas that were in bottomland hardwoods that could grow loblolly pine have been converted to loblolly pine because it pays more at the finished product than the bottomland hardwoods do. So you end up with, in many places, a very artificial landscape, very different from the original landscape.
Another problem with increasing urbanization in the piney woods is the introduction of invasive species. People plant Chinese tallow or Asian privet in the yards, and those plants escape into our natural systems. And these invasive plants are causing tremendous problems in East Texas.
Conservation and restoration efforts are essential for the survival of this ecosystem. The Texas Wildlife Action Plan encourages continued technical guidance as well as incentives for private landowners to voluntarily protect wildlife habitats.
Texas Parks and Wildlife Department and the Texas Forest Service jointly work with private landowners to enroll them in conservation agreements so that we've relieved them of the fear of having red-cockaded woodpeckers.
It's encouraging to see that the logging industry is changing some of the historic practices and is moving away from replacing some of the clear-cut areas with monocultured stands of loblolly pine. We're beginning to see a little more diversity being planted back into the areas that have been harvested.
Industry steps to promote diversity is a positive direction, but water conservation, invasive plants and animals, as well as land fragmentation and erosion will continue to be important challenges facing the Piney Woods ecoregion.
We need to strive to work with landowners, with corporate landowners, government entities, to try to manage as much of this habitat as we can.
Yay, okay. And let's finish this up.
And neither one of us have been asked to take them.
Oops. Exactly. Alrighty, so we are done. You have a graded exit question and then an assignment. And people, go into Schoology, look for what you're missing, take care of it. And that's all I have today. Tomorrow, tomorrow, we'll be in our classrooms tomorrow, Miss Sobey. Miss Sobey, we're in our classes tomorrow? As far as we know, we are in our classroom tomorrow, so that's for the people who come on campus. All right, if not, everybody else will hook up with you via the internet. All right, y'all have a good day. I'll see y'all tomorrow.